Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the second annual Jewish Arts and Bookfest. I'm really delighted that you're here. I'm Hannah Weissman, Executive Director of the Magnes Collection of Jewish Art and Life, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all today and thank you on behalf of the entire Magnes team, particularly Dan Alter, who is the Magnes' Learning and Engagement Coordinator and has coordinated and organized and shepherded and stewarded this entire event for about a year now. So if you see him today, please do extend your thanks. Today's event would also not be possible without the support of our many partners, colleagues, and community members who made the event possible. I'd like to especially acknowledge our presenting partners, JCC East Bay, the Jewish News of Northern California, Jewish Community Library, and New Lair House, as well as our sponsors for today, Dina Bookstein, Bonnie Burt, Valerie Feldman, Anne Germanicos, and Fran Quittel, as well as the Helen and Albert Colin Endowment of the Magnes Museum Foundation. Each of our sponsors shares our vision of the Magnes as a space for community building and for conversation, and I'm delighted that you have chosen to share in that vision today. I also want to extend a warm welcome and thank you to Berkeley City Council member Igor Tragub for joining us in celebrating Jewish American Heritage Month. Your commitment to the city of Berkeley and to the district is greatly appreciated and so obvious when we see you out in the community and participating alongside all of us. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to turn over the lectern to Stav for our very first program.
You're all hearing me? So first of all, just an early warning. This is a very visual presentation. We're going to be looking at a lot of tarot cards. So if you're sitting way in the back and you want to see the details, I would invite you to sit closer, but no worries, no stress, no pressure. And before, primarily what we're going to be doing, we're going to be walking through a bunch of tarot cards in the time we have together. But there's a few things I need to say at the beginning, just so you know with whom you're speaking. I make this public declaration that I myself am not a tarot card reader. I am not able to see your future. I have no prophetic abilities whatsoever. And outside of this one tiny area of my life, I'm actually a very ordinary and boring person. One thing that's a little interesting is that I have spent a lot of time studying Torah, and I studied Torah in Hebrew. One piece of life advice I can give is that if you study a little bit of Torah every day, just 2 or 3 sentences, if you do that for 40 years, at the end of 40 years, you will know a lot of Torah. Okay, so the way this story begins about 10 years ago when my wife, strangely enough, one day brought home a deck of tarot cards. And I had a very serious business career in data analytics. Tarot cards were a strange object in our house. I was like, why did you buy a deck of tarot cards? And she said, oh, it was for sale cheap in the bookstore. I thought it would be a fun imagination game to play with the kids. You could make stories with the figures. All right, so I started playing with the cards with my kids, who were little at the time. And what was strange to me is that when I opened up the cards and played with them, it was funny to me that they had depictions of Bible stories in the cards. I had no idea there was a connection between Bible stories and tarot cards. And I did this more and more, and the Bible was becoming clearer and clearer to me. So I started researching. Why did someone decide to depict stories of the Bible in tarot cards? And to my surprise, in the official literature on the history of the Tarot, there was no mention of the biblical imagery at all, which I found very puzzling. So I began buying more books on the history of the Tarot and buying more copies of the Tarot. And I developed what you would call an obsession with the Tarot, which I understand is fairly common in the tarot community. And I noticed that the biblical references were clearer in older versions of the Tarot. And I began to follow this trail backwards in time until I encountered this deck called the Jean Noblet Tarot de Marseille. And that's the deck I'll be showing you today. And in that deck, to my eyes, not only were there Bible stories, but the figures were holding their bodies in the shape of Hebrew letters. And I could see them holding Judaic ritual objects, and even there were depictions of Jewish holy days. And then I realized I wasn't seeing Bible stories at all, I was seeing Torah stories. And when I placed that into the historical context of what was going on in the Jewish community at the time when these cards were made, a lot of things came into focus. And that led me on this journey it took me about 5 or 6 years to fully decipher and decode the concealed Judaic of the Jean Noblet Tarot de Marseille. And the summary of that, I'm going to kind of give you highlights of the summary of that. Now, but before I jump to the cards, I have to give you 2 very short historical lectures. I have to give you a lecture on the history of the Tarot, and then another lecture on the history of the Jews of the Renaissance. I'll try to make it really short and concise. These are the tarot cards. When most of you think of tarot cards, you think of these cards, right? Right? You've seen these? Just as a side note, the reason why these cards are so famous is the copyright for them was purchased by a businessman from Brooklyn, Stuart Kaplan, who created this company called US Games, and he reproduced this about 100 million times. And this is the reason why we all know about the Tarot. And just by strange coincidence, Stuart Kaplan is, yes, Jewish. That's a side note. But many people don't know is that that was not the original Tarot. This is the Rider Waite Smith deck made from 1909. This was made by Arthur Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith. But there's a long tradition of tarot cards that extend back to the 1400s. This is one of the oldest known tarot cards. This is held in the Morgan Library. Morgan was a big collector of tarot cards. And this card is very beautiful. It's gilded in gold. And people in the Renaissance were crazy about gambling. Gambling was like the PlayStation of their time. And actually, they weren't called Tarot back then. They were called Triumphi cards or Triumph cards. And this is the card, and in the 1600s and 1700s, there arose this very specific template of 22 core picture cards. And they were printed with woodblock prints and printed at scale. And then here, this is a deck made by an esotericist, Oswald Wirth was his name. If you notice something strange, there's a letter Olive on the card. And here's the Rider Waite Smith. And this is the full-blown occult Tarot. And tarot historians will tell you that at this period, the Tarot was exclusively used for gambling and playing cards. And then here is where the occult Tarot arrives. And this is a full-blown esoteric object. And one of the reasons why there became this association of there's 22 core unique picture cards in the Tarot de Marseille. And there happened to be, by strange coincidence, 22 Hebrew letters. And people began to associate the two. And that was one of the reasons why it became an object of the occult and esoterica and fortune telling. And this deck is a mystical object, but it's not a mystery. The reason I say that is if you want to know what the cards mean, Arthur Waite wrote a book which explains the meaning of each card. This deck is very beautiful. It's also not a mystery. It has all these kind of standard depictions of Renaissance life. This deck, however, is a mystery. Why is it a mystery? When you go through the cards, it's filled with all these very enigmatic, strange figures. Like, why is he holding a wand? Why does the table only have 3 legs? What are those things on the table? And they promise this coherent narrative, but no one's able to figure it out. And it's given birth to this amazing genre of literature of tarot hermeneutics, where people speculate as to the secret content of the Tarot de Marseille. Now, one of the reasons why of that association of the 22 picture cards or major arcana with the 22 Hebrew letters and the rise of the Tarot as an object of esoterica and the occult and fortune telling, a lot of it can be credited to this man. His name is Eliphas Levi. Well, his real name was Louis Constant. He was a French Catholic who wrote under a Hebrew pen name, Eliphas Levi. And he wrote this book called Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, in which he presented what he called a magical new version of Kabbalah. And this is what became occult Kabbalah. And occult Kabbalah is kind of it's a universal syncretic version of Kabbalah. And Eliphas Levi claimed it predated Judaic Kabbalah. And it was a universal symbolic mystic system. And he said specifically that the 22 major arcana of the Tarot de Marseille were secret vessels for the Kabbalistic Hebrew letters. And that gave rise to what we now call occult Kabbalah. People spell it with a Q. And when you see all this Hebrew in the Rider Waite Smith deck, people say, oh, that's occult Kabbalah. That's Eliphas Levi's occult Kabbalah. And this is like a drawing of his from his book, Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. You know, that's King Solomon. And he really leveraged the idea of the Jew as the magic man, the Jewish magical wizard. And in the 80s arose this new crop of tarot historians, the most famous being Michael Dummett. Michael Dummett was a very serious British academic and historian, and he wrote this book called The Game of Tarot, From Ferrara to Salt Lake City. And when he detailed all the ways the Tarot was used for gambling, this like big encyclopedia of all the gambling games of Tarot. That was his main thesis. His secondary thesis was that Eliphas Levi and Aleister Crowley and Arthur Waite, he said their invention of the occult Kabbalah and the occult Tarot was a big lie, that they were charlatans and frauds. This was just like a big scam that they created. He said at best, Eliphas Levi was a deluded fool. At worst, he was an intentional charlatan. And if you ask most tarot historians, they will tell you yes. They'll say there was never any connection between the Tarot de Marseille and the Hebrew alphabet before Eliphas Levi made that connection. The association between the two is rooted in a numeric coincidence, and there's nothing else to the story whatsoever. And this debate continues. Tarot historians always say, this is a fraud, fraud, fraud. Tarot occultists say, Kabbalah, Kabbalah, Kabbalah. To this day, they repeat this conversation over and over. And strangely enough, neither group, neither the tarot historians or the tarot occultists ever thought to think, wait a second, 22 secret Hebrew letters created in the 1500s, who, in this historical framework, would have a reason to hide Hebrew letters in a deck of playing cards. All right, that concludes my first lecture. We're now going to go to my second lecture is even faster. Anyone want to guess what these dates are on this map? These are the dates of the expulsions when that region decided to send its Jews into exile. We remember the expulsion of 1492, not because it was the last or the first, but because it was really the largest. In 1492, that was the destruction of the largest Jewish population in the world at that time. There were successive rounds of expulsions. The Roman Catholic Church at that time had targeted Judaism for destruction. They were the most visible dissenters from the spiritual authority of the church. Now, here, I've put this in red, because actually northern Italy, was by coincidence the birthplace of the Tarot, but that's just a coincidence, I'm sure. Northern Italy did not send its Jews into exile. What it did is it created the ghetto system, where it confined all the Jews into very small, crowded areas. The papal bull at that time said, isn't it absurd that our streets are filled with so many Jews? We are the capital of the Catholic kingdom. And the reason is that so many Jews were fleeing Spain and France and the UK that they were making their way to northern Italy, specifically one town in particular, Ferrara. The Duke of Ferrara had a war with Venice, and he needed to raise money very quickly. So he came up with a very clever plan of declaring Ferrara a safe zone where Jews could practice Judaism openly. It was a way for him to lure wealthy families from Spain and Portugal. Now, if you were faced with this challenge of, so when there was an expulsion, especially in Spain, you had a choice. You could either convert to Catholicism, or you could surrender your assets and accept a life of basically being a penniless beggar. And this is the image of the wandering, impoverished Jew comes from this time. And you have to realize this was if you were a Jew of faith, this was a very difficult decision, because if you have faith, to convert to Catholicism is to truly put your eternal soul at risk. People really had real fear of the wrath of God. But if you accepted impoverishment, often you could cross the border and immediately be captured and sent into slavery, or forced onto being forced labor on a rowing ship, or even things far worse. So many people, when they're faced with this decision of either eternal damnation of my soul or damnation of my body in this world, many people chose a third option, which was to publicly convert to Catholicism, but in secret preserve some tiny thread of Judaic observance. And this is what's now known as crypto-Judaism or secret Judaism. And in the early 1500s, in many ways, this was the normative form of Judaism. People who pretended to be Catholic just long enough to get to some place where they could observe Judaism openly. And crypto-Jews were incredibly inventive in finding ways to observe Judaism in secret. Purim was reinvented as the festival of Saint Esther. They would eat flatbread in the spring. They would light Shabbat candles underneath a table or behind closed doors. They invented recipes that would disguise kosher meat as non-kosher meat. And in addition, they would often gather for prayer or study under the guise of playing cards. And that ends my second lecture. Now you know all that's necessary. Now you know the historical context of when these cards were first made. The original Tarot de Marseille is long gone. The oldest example we have of the Tarot de Marseille happens to be the Noble from around 1650. But we know from written accounts that the tradition of these cards is at least 100, if not 150 years older. But just those older examples are no longer around. They've dissolved over time. Here's the magician you all know and love, the Rider-Waite-Smith. This is how it looked in 1650. So this card's over 400 years old. There's only one copy of the Noble Tarot. It sits in the French National Archives. Anyone want to venture a guess what he's holding in his hand? Excuse me? A yad. That's a good guess. What else might I look at? It could look like a krog or two. Anything else? So did someone say something horrible? What? It looks like a circumcised fetus, yes. So often, when I often speak at synagogues. I have a very fun moment where I wait to see how long it takes someone to say the word penis out loud. The range is from 5 seconds to 5 minutes, but okay. Here, these are images of antique circumcision kits. Actually, this one in the middle, this is actually from the collection here. This is off the Magnes' website. So in a traditional circumcision kit, there's a book, there's a prayer book, there's a cup for wine, there's a cup for spices, there's a dish for sand, because when you remove a foreskin, you put it in sand. There's a triangular object, which is a magen, a shield. You put it in front of the penis, you pull the foreskin through, you cut the foreskin so you don't do damage to the inner organ of the penis. Why are there dice? So the dice, if you go back to the older Triumphi cards that predate this card, this image was of a street magician or a street entertainer. He often had dice. Here, these dice, if you count the spots on top, there are 8 spots. There are 15 spots altogether, which is a Kabbalistic code for the name of God. The suggestion being this card is a hijacking of the older Italian cards that contains a secret depiction of circumcision. If you notice, he's holding his arms like the letter Aleph. Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph is also the first letter in Avraham, the first patriarch to undergo circumcision. And remember that Rider-Waite-Smith deck? Isn't it strange if you take this magician and you pair it with the other magician, the later magician, Arthur Waite's magician, you get the full letter Aleph. The two sets of arms together, one conceals what the other reveals, one reveals what the other conceals. And this is the methodology. I'm going to show you this methodology over and over again, card after card, where half the Hebrew letter is present, half is concealed. So the letters are presented in a way that if you know the Hebrew alphabet well, you will recognize the letter. But if you do not know the Hebrew alphabet, you would be unaware of its presence. Here's something else in Rider-Waite's. I don't know if this is intentional, but there's this kind of very strange placement of the hilt of the sword. Is that a coincidence or not? I don't know. Arthur Waite in his deck, he left all these little signs that perhaps he knew very well about the secret original content of the Tarot, but for whatever reason, he never wrote about it publicly. You may be asking why he's holding it in his hand. Sefer Yetzirah is an old Kabbalistic text, arguably the oldest Kabbalistic text. And there's this very beautiful description about Abraham making his covenant. And there's a very specific line where he says, he made with him a covenant between the 10 fingers of his hands. And the covenant is the Brit Milah, the symbol of the covenant. And this is the methodology I'm going to show you over and over where the artist makes a very hyper-literal depiction of specific lines of the Torah or the Talmud or key Kabbalistic texts. On his chest are 12 stripes, 12 blue stripes, which is a symbol for, 12 is a motif from the Torah. It represents the 12 tribes of Israel. You can find these 12 stripes repeat themselves throughout the deck over and over again. On his table is this interesting, so on the table there's this triangular object, which I thought was him again. When I was posting this online, discussing with people, a professor of religious studies in Los Angeles wrote me. He said that's what's called an angel script letter. I didn't know about this before, but so apparently the Kabbalists at this time, they would use alternative versions of the Hebrew alphabet to inscribe what we could now call them special prayers, which is a modern euphemism for magic spells, like spells for protection or spells for luck or spells for power. And our theory was that that might be a letter Zion, because in the kind of poetical Kabbalistic understanding of the Hebrew alphabet, Zion was said to be a symbol for a circumcised penis, because it's a crown on top of a shaft. And lo and behold, but the problem is there's many different versions of the angel script letters. It's not like the Hebrew alphabet where it's standardized. So it took me a long time, and eventually I found this book. This is a book printed called Miknei Avraham, printed by Daniel Bomberg in the 1500s in Venice. Bomberg also happened to be the first printer who produced the very first printed Talmud, full, complete Talmud. And in this book, Miknei Avraham, there was a guide to the angel script letters, and we found our letter Zion. So just this alone, so appreciate that in the contemporary understanding of the Tarot, if you ask any serious Tarot historian, they'll say there was no esoteric content to the Tarot prior to Eliphaz Levi. Here, this is conclusive evidence that there was esoteric content, a secret story to the Tarot, at least 200 years before Eliphaz Levi. And this alone completely destroys our current understanding of the Tarot. And last, so this strange, what is this strange hat? Does anyone want to guess what this strange hat might be? No wild guess? It might be, right, because that's what, in Arthur Waite's deck, there's like an infinity symbol. And it might be infinity. So infinity, the way you say in Hebrew, the way you say infinity is Ein Sof. Ein Sof happens to be often the name of the top of the tree of life. The top of the tree of life is often called Keter, and the very top of a circumcised penis is also often called Keter, which is associated with the tree. So people say that when you undergo circumcision, you're joining a pact with the divine, with the infinite. And at this time in the Jewish world, there was a huge debate about whether or not to circumcise your sons. If you don't circumcise your son, he is outside of the borders of the community of Israel, as very clearly stated in the Torah. But if you do circumcise your son, he's targeted for very easy detection by the church for the crime of Judaizing, secret Jewish observance. And there was a huge debate in the Jewish community about whether or not to circumcise your sons. And if you read the records of the Inquisition, the very first thing they document when they arrested someone, the very first thing they would document is whether or not, if it was a male, the first thing they would document is whether or not they were circumcised. But the rabbi still insisted, despite the tremendous dangers, it is important to circumcise your sons. So this is my theory. I think this is a depiction of how to perform a proper circumcision, to fully remove the foreskin of the atara, of the crown of the penis. But that's my interpretation. So I'm going to, very quickly, I'm going to go through a bunch more cards. I'm going to try to establish 4 themes. The themes of Hebrew letters, Torah stories, Judaic ritual objects, and Jewish holy days. One thing I need to convey is that the Noble Torah, in my opinion, it's an absolute masterpiece of cryptography and ingenuity and creativity. It really deserves to be well known and studied. And unfortunately, for me to fully give you a tour of all the Judaic content would probably take me about 3 days. So while I have you as a captive audience, I'm going to show you I'm going to show you just enough information to establish these consistent patterns of content in the cards. But just know this deck is far deeper and far more sophisticated than I can convey in the limited time I have right now. Also, and if while I'm presenting, if you guys want to interrupt me with questions or comments, just raise your hand. I'm happy to lecture, but I'm a better conversationalist, so feel free to interrupt. This is the hangman. This is the hangman most of you have probably seen in life. This is the Rader White Smith hangman. This is the hangman from 1650. So now that I've told you the foundational secret of the Torah, who is this person? Haman, right. It took you 1 second to solve it. So, because yeah, for those of you who don't know, in Judaism we have a holiday every year, Purim, in which we have a big party celebrating the hanging of a particular man, Haman, the villain of Purim. And I've read an embarrassingly large number of books on the history of the Torah, speculative history, speculative hermeneutics. The number of times I've read people speculate that this might be Haman is exactly 0. And it's a great example, of the follies of interpretation. That if you have one lens of interpretation, you will never connect it to Haman. And if you have another lens, Haman jumps out immediately. And this is very odd because there's actually a depiction of the hanging of Haman on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It was actually a very common theme in Renaissance art. And if you notice, true to the pattern I claimed before, Lamed is the 12th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. If you can see, his leg is in the shape of the letter Lamed. If you know Hebrew well, you will see it. If you do not know Hebrew, you will not see it. And I will show you how this card contains a very concise and efficient summary of the story of Purim. Haman was famously hung alongside his 10 sons. And you can see there's 10 cuts of wood on either side of him. Haman was hung, who tola be'etz. He was hung specifically from a tree, the text says. He's hung from a tree. In the Talmud, there's a midrash, a story, that his daughter also threw herself to her death. There's an 11th cut on top. Purim is on the 14th day of the 12th month. He has 14 buttons. The card number is 12. And Purim is famously known as the upside down holiday. If you don't believe, you can Google Purim upside down. You'll see 1,000 articles. Every rabbi at one point writes an article about Purim as the day of sudden reversals and surprises. And it's because there's a very specific line in Esther 9:20. There's a very specific line in Megillat Esther where it says, "Hayom hazeh nafoch miyagon l'simcha." This day was turned over from one of mourning into one of joy. The hangman is literally turned over into joy. Haman's superpower was lashon hara, the evil tongue. He would create plots and lies with his tongue. So it used to be a tradition to eat pickled tongue on Purim. You would literally eat his evil tongue. Notice he has a big red tongue. For some reason that went out of fashion. I do not know why. And that's an image of a big Purim party. And here are depictions of Haman being hung with his 10 sons from Megillot Esther from that time. Again, now there's actually a lot more to this card, believe it or not, but I'm giving you just enough information to establish the same consistent pattern. Before I go to another card, any questions or comments? Challenges? You guys all with me? Yes?
Is the red hair something from the story?
Yes, interesting enough. So there's so much beauty in these cards. One thing that makes me sad when I do these presentations is how much content I have to skip. So if you count the strands of hair, there are 16 strands of hair. Haman's tribe was Amalek, which is spelled with an ayin. But there's a midrash in the Talmud that Haman's original job was that he was a barber. And and Haman was summoned to the king's palace, and the king said, "Oh, I'm going to have a big party to celebrate Mordechai. I want you to give Mordechai a haircut, and I want you to bathe him." And so the idea is that his hair was all wild because instead of giving himself a haircut, he had to give Mordechai a haircut. That's what I believe. So it's like all these little cues. And this is where I'm theorizing. I believe these cards were used as a mnemonic device, a memory device, where someone would say, "Oh, what does this hair mean?" And it would be an excuse to let me tell you another story. Let me tell you another story about Haman, or another detail. Any other questions? Yes?
What about upside down hanging?
So Purim is the upside down day. It's the day of sudden reversals. And there's a very specific line where it says, Haman was turned, but he was also turned over upon his own head. And that's a continual, because in Purim, the Jews expected that they were going to be slaughtered, that at the last minute it was Haman and his tribe slaughtered. So again, it's a literal depiction of that specific line from Megillat Esther. Other questions, comments? I'll go on, okay? So this is one of the most famous cards. It's called the Tower. When people think of the Tower, what Bible story do you think of when you think of the Tower? Tower of Babel. It's obvious, right? However, that wasn't the original title of the card. Arthur Waite changed the title. The original title was La Maison Dieu, which means the house of God. And in Judaism, anyone want to guess what this card is? The Mishkan, right? So the Mishkan, if you read in the Tanakh, when it says the Mishkan, it says Beit Adonai. Literally, it says Beit Adonai. And if you were forced to translate it, you would say the house of God. Now, anyone, what's the secret content besides Beit, but it's being destroyed. So any guess what this might be? More specific. Even more specific. Think of the burning the first temple. But there's, okay, so in Judaism, we have a holiday where we celebrate the hanging of Haman. We have another holiday. Going the wrong way. There's another holiday. Every year, we have a day of mourning where we mourn the destruction of the temple. It's called Tisha B'Av. Tisha literally means ninth. Av, so there's 4 ways to count the months of the year in Judaism. In one system, Av is the 11th month. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, very thoughtful, very thoughtful. Av is the 11th month, and it's a day in which we mourn the destruction of the temple, of the Beit HaMikdash, or the house of God. And I'm going to show you very quickly how this is a secret depiction of Tisha B'Av. First of all, in the temple was the Ark of the Covenant, and inside the Ark of the Covenant were the 2 tablets, the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the tablets of the 10 Commandments. And you can see these 2 windows are in the shape of the 10 Commandments. Interesting, if you count the rows of bricks, you will see that the 10 Commandments sit on the 12th row of bricks. Again, that repeat motif of the number 12. If you count, there are 30 orbs in the sky. There's 8 crowns. 30 is a traditional period of mourning in Judaism, which is a number that comes up in the liturgy around Tisha B'Av. The 2 temples stood for 830 years. So notice how the cards contain details that's a springboard for me to tell you about the history of the Beit HaMikdash. And the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, it was foreseen by the prophet Ezekiel. And there's a great description of this in the prophet's writings, the book of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel saw this vision of all these orbs of light flying in the air. And he saw 4 animals with 4 faces within 2 wheels within wheels, all covered in eyes. And above this chariot, what they call the chariot, he could see an image of a man who began to proclaim his judgment against Jerusalem for the moral failings of the people of Judea. And he said, I'm going to remove the turban and remove the crown. I'm going to cast off the people to the 4 corners of the earth. I'm showing you how this card is filled with these very literal lines from the Tanakh, from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, he breaks through a hole in the wall, and he sees the high priests. And the high priests are in the midst of doing sacrifices to alien gods and foreign fetishes. And Ezekiel tells them of the coming judgment against Jerusalem. And one of the high priests falls down to the ground dead. And then Ezekiel throws himself on the ground. And he says, "Oh God, will you not preserve at least a remnant of Israel?" So this man falling is the priest falling. This is Ezekiel throwing himself on the ground. And again, I'm just conveying the same motif of very literal, specific lines from the Tanakh preserved in a visual means. In this last detail, it's going to take me a few sentences to explain this. But when I saw this is when I was really filled with awe as to the genius of the Noble Tarot, the incredible attention to detail. When I saw this, it made me realize that this was not created in a few weeks or a few months, that possibly this was created by a group of artists over years. So on Tisha B'Av, on Erev Tisha B'Av, the night before Tisha B'Av, it's traditional to read the Book of Lamentations, Eicha. Eicha is famously a biblical acrostic. And by that it means that every row of Eicha begins with another letter of the Hebrew Aleph Bet. It goes Aleph Bet Gimel Daled. But the order of the letters in Eicha is broken. Usually Ayin is the 16th letter, and Pei is the 17th. But in Eicha, it comes Pei before Ayin. Pei literally means mouth. Ayin means eye. And the rabbi said the reason the Aleph Bet is broken in Eicha is because people spoke evil with their mouths before seeing good with their eyes. They spoke first before seeing. And this is actually a page from Eicha. And you can see I'm showing the 16th row has a Pei, the 17th row has an Ayin. If you come to the tower, it's broken at exactly the 16th row of bricks. And Ayin is the 16th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This figure is in the shape of Ayin. So think of the genius of this. They made a visual depiction of Eicha that would never be detected by someone who wasn't deeply and intimately familiar with Judaism. And for me, this just shows the amazing attention to detail with which these artists invested in the creation of this deck. And here's like clip art from that time. Here's modern clip art showing you this is Tisha B'Av of the tall tower and the flames. This is the consistent theme when you try to depict Tisha B'Av. Questions or comments before I go to another one? No? No questions or comments? Okay. This is the 13th card. And there's a Hebrew letter that this is one of the Hebrew letters that really popped out to me. It's a tzaddik. Tzaddik, however, is the 18th letter. For some reason, the mem and tzaddik have primarily been switched. And mem and tzaddik have something in common, is that there's a regular version, and there's a mem and tzaddik sofit, versions of the letters when they appear at the end of a word. And they are the 13th and 18th cards. And you can find, in the 13th card, you find the regular forms, and in the 18th card, you find the end of word forms. There's a very beautiful reason why they did this, but that would take a long time to explain. For now, I'm just going to focus on the tzaddik. So this is the death card. And tzaddik is a homonym. So tzaddik means the Hebrew letter tzaddik, but it also means a righteous person. And remember, this is the 13th card. Judaism at that time, a few centuries beforehand, had been summarized in 13 core articles of faith. The 13th article of faith is belief in Tchiat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. And the belief is that at the end of time, all the dead will come back to life, but not everybody comes back to life. It's actually a very specific subset of people, and that is the tzaddikim, the righteous people. And by coincidence, this is the 13th card. So in many ways, this card is a depiction of Tchiat HaMetim. So it says the death card, but it's the resurrection of the death card in a Jewish framework. Now when Ezekiel, this is rooted in another vision from Ezekiel. In the book of Ezekiel, God comes to Ezekiel and he grabs him by the tuft of his hair. And he carries him away to this valley filled with all these dry bones. And the dry bones come back to life. They grow muscles and skin. And that's the kind of the birth of this belief in the Tchiat HaMetim, resurrection of the dead. But the tuft of hair on his head, in the book of Ezekiel, the word is tzitzit. They use the word tzitzit. And tzitzit is the same word for the tassel of a prayer shawl. So you see on his head is actually the tassel of a prayer shawl. And if you look closely, tzitzit, also spelled with a tzaddik, his legs, this figure's legs are tzitzit tassels. You can see that these knots on his knees and his arms. Those are the knots of tzitzit. Tzaddik for tzitzit. So this is it's a concealed Judaic object. Now someone here should be thinking right now, okay, that's cute, Stav. But for me to really believe that, you'd have to show me a consistent pattern of ritual objects concealed in the same methodology, right? Right? This is the Hermit, Rader White Smith, the Noble version. Notice in Rader White Smith deck, there's a Magen David, a Jewish star in his Hermit. The 9th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is a Tet. Tet is the first letter in Talit, which is a prayer shawl. He's actually wearing a talit. Look at the fold on his shoulder. It's the traditional fold. What looks like his hair is actually the crown of the Torah. When you wear a talit, you often wear a tefillin. On the tefillin is a 4-pronged shin and a 3-pronged shin. The tuft of hair on his forehead is the 4-pronged shin turned on its side. Again, in a way that only if you know the secret would you recognize it. This is another tarot made by a contemporary of Arthur Waite called the Hermetic Tarot. And in their version, the hermit is just outwardly wearing a talit. Again, there's another suggestion that in the occult circles of the Golden Dawn that they knew very well about the secret concealed Jewish tradition. But for whatever reason, it didn't really fit their project to share that content. The 14th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Nun. This figure is the shape of the figure is in the shape of the letter Nun. Nun is the first letter in Netilat Yadayim. Netilat Yadayim is the Jewish ritual of washing your hands. So if you're an Orthodox Jew, you're constantly washing your hands. You wash your hands before prayer, before you eat, after you use the facilities. And at this time, before the invention of modern plumbing, the ritual of Netilat Yadayim was a real logistical burden. It was like you constantly had to get fresh water with which to wash your hands. And the Holy Office of the Inquisition had published a guide as to how to recognize whether or not your neighbor is a secret Jew. And one of the symptoms of secret, covert Judaic observance was frequent hand washing. And notice in Arthur Waite's version, there's actually the name of God, the tetragrammaton, on the person's shirt. This is the emperor. Dalet is the 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's the first letter in dreidel. The emperor's helmet is a secret dreidel. Mem is the main theme of the 18th card. Mem is the first letter of menorah. This lobster is a secret menorah. This lobster has a lot of content in it. The 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Yud. Is Yud. It's a close homonym for Yad. A Yad is a Torah pointer. Notice how the figure on top, he looks like he's holding a stick. He's holding his hand out very purposely. He's an anthropomorphized Yad pointer, a Torah pointer. And again, if I had your time, if I could capture you and force you to listen to me, I could give you there's a complete directory of all the essential Judaic ritual objects of Judaism concealed with the same methodology. Likewise, you can find a full guide to all the 22 Hebrew letters concealed in the same methodology, each card in some way associated with that specific number. And there is a very complete guide to the essential holy days of observance of Judaism. I'm going to do one last card really quickly. I just have you for a few minutes. This is a secret depiction of Shabbat. Their arms are held like Kuf. Kuf is the first letter in Kodesh, holy. There's a shin in the negative space of their legs, Shabbat, Kodesh, the holy Shabbat. And in Judaism, we call Shabbat, we call it the greeting of the Shabbat bride. Literally, this is a greeting of the Shabbat bride. It's a very literal, visceral depiction. There's a lot of vulgarity in the cards. I don't know whether it's meant to be humorous or maybe it's just a great disguise. Who would ever suspect that something this vulgar would be a secret vessel for a holy book? When does Shabbat begin? Yes, but more specifically, Judaism is far more specific. When does Shabbat begin? No, much more specific than that. Yes, how many? No, that's when it ends. When does it begin? 18, someone said 18, yes. Shabbat begins 18 minutes before the sun goes down. If you count the spots in the sky, there are 18 spots in the sky. If you count the rays in the sun, there are exactly 18 rays in the sun. On Shabbat, it is forbidden to work, but there are certain activities you can do within the confines of an Eruv wall, right? Now, notice there's a wall in the background. Now, the rabbis, they went to great effort to define all the different forms of labor that are forbidden. Anyone know how many forms of labor are forbidden on Shabbat? 39. You had a good education, I can tell. You're getting all that good. If you count the bricks in the wall, there are exactly 39. Someone has made a very comprehensive summary of Shabbat Kodesh, the Holy Shabbat, in this card. This deck was made in 1760. It's the Convert Tarot, very famous tarot. there are not 18 spots in the sky. There are not 18 rays in the sun. If you count the bricks in the wall, there are not 39. That tells me whoever made this deck, they didn't know about the secret mission. They didn't know about the secret content, or it wasn't, they were just making a copy to sell so that people could gamble with it. But who are these boys? Who are these boys? Think about the methodology I taught you. Who are these boys? Okay, I would just remember what I taught you guys. I believe that they are Shabbat candles. This guy's even got he's got like a tail. He even has a piece of wick. They're flaming yellow hair. What does it mean? What does it tell us that here there's a Judaic ritual object that is not so present here? That tells me that once upon a time, there were many other knowingly Jewish versions of the cards. There were other Torah cards out there that are lost to us. They got lost over time. And this is just like an echo. It's a shadow of that knowingly Jewish deck that's preserved just because people were making copies after copies after copies. I go around and I share this story because there's this whole really beautiful story about Jewish continuity and survival at a time of intense persecution that is lying. It's been secretly hiding in these cards for 400 years. So thank you. That's my core presentation. Thank you very much. And Ayin Press, we produced a modern reproduction of the Noble Torah, along with a very concise book, which is a guide of all the concealed Judaic you can find in the cards. And I think it might be for sale here, I think. So thank you very much for your time. And if people want, I'm going to be around, so if people have questions or comments, I'm happy to banter more. Thank you.